very pleased that Dr. Peter Moore has come along to talk to us today on that. And he's a tutor for the MSc Science Communication course at the University of the West of England in Bristol. He's an honorary fellow in ethics at Trinity College at Bristol, and also leads training courses on different aspects of writing and editing, both in the UK and Europe. And he's won national awards for his writing. And I do hope that you will look at some of the books that we have here written by Peter out in the bookstore. This one is called Being Me, What It Means to Be Human. And this one is Babel's Shadow, Genetic Technologies in a Fractured or Fracturing Society, which I very much recommend. I have read that one, not the other one. But Peter seems to have a huge output of books. I don't know how he does it, but there seems to be almost a new one coming out every year, and I gather 2 more in the pipeline, something like that. So do look out for his books. He's also been involved in a number of consultations on ethical issues in various contexts, as well as his writing activities. So we're very pleased again to tell us about ethical issues raised by science. Over to you, Peter. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's always very shocking when you hear yourself described. I'm also human. Inflammable. But it's fun to be here. I mean, I'm a freelance, so the majority of my life I live in my house. I commute 8 steps from the kitchen to work, which is a little hole at the back of my garage that I've sort of converted. And I've been freelance for 12 years, so any opportunity I actually have to get out and talk to people, I value greatly. And more because it's the next bit I'm interested in, where you do some talking back to me, but you have to get my payments of me talking to you first, I guess. Ethical issues raised by science. 2000 was the point when there was published a document from the House of Lords by the Science and Technology Committee. It's called Science and Society. And to my mind, the document fell down and was useless after its first sentence. And I argued that with Lord Jenkins, who was the chap in charge of it. It doesn't seem a very controversial sentence to many people. Society's relationship with science is in the critical phase. By science, maybe it's pejorative to put it in inverted commas for the first talk, like evil. Never mind. With science, we mean biological and physical sciences and their technological applications. Now, if you're asking us society's response to something, and we're getting into an ethical debate about it, I think to clump that in with science is a problem. I don't quite see them as 2 non-overlapping magisteria, and we'll see why in a moment, but they're very different areas of work. In science, as I see science, we're fundamentally dealing with uncertainty and probability. In technology, we're dealing with experience and safety margins. If I go into a doctor, the last thing I want to meet is a scientist. I want to meet a very good technologist. Probably better still an artist who's quite good at the technology. In science, we're in the world of hypothesis and theory. It's empirical, we want to measure everything in science. Technology, don't actually care. If it works, that's good enough. You can build jolly good bridges without a clue of science, and if the truck gets from one side to the other, terrific. Now the scientists can go and measure it and tell you why it works and what the margins are, but technology actually isn't interested in that. Science, I would argue, purely is value-free in its pure sense. Technology is value-driven, particularly in the choice of use. So therefore, if we start to ask the ethics, you'll end up with 2 very different environments. Ethics in science, we come down to choice of topic, we come down to the methods of research, and then out of it, it's got a whole bunch of implications that we have to take on board. Ethics around technology, there's an overlap there, human impact, environmental impact. I think it's really about power and control and those standard sort of areas of interaction of people. Now, okay, I'm not arguing that they are totally separate and they merge together, and the merge is quite complex. Science builds technology. You can't do science without technology. That's certainly not the way it's done now. So it's easy to see how you can simply merge these two together and pretend they're one. I think that's an unfortunate merging for any analysis that tries to work out what's going on. As my title today was much more to do with science, I'm going to try to stick as far as I can in that blue zone. I'll drift into the red occasionally, but I want to try to concentrate on the blue zone today. Tomorrow when we start talking, or when I talk about the public mind, I think the public is so confused we can't play this game of differentiation. So it's going to be a bit more of a splurge of those two. So anyway, science. If we look at the ethical issues, now ethics is around balancing right and wrong, benefit and harm. It's more than social conventions, they're morals. But it's the teasing to pieces, teasing apart, that trying to make sense of how you get there. And we'll look at that in a moment again. When we come across to the issues, I want to have a look at 3 repeating themes, and I'll spend most of my time actually around identity. But I think there's a lot of ethical issues that are being kicked up in the form of identity that come out of science. My branch of science, I'm a physiologist in the deep and distant past, and bioethics is going to be one of the ones that comes to me. And if there's physicists or people from another discipline who can point to the ethical issues I've missed from their own disciplines, and that'll be great over conversation. Trust and choice will be the other themes that I'm looking about. So identity, it's a piece of string to an extent. When does identity start? When does it finish? How long is your piece of string? And I think it's getting more and more complex and confused to work that one out. But we'll start at the beginning. In terms of our identity, science has actually challenged us in a number of different times and places. And one of those challenges is that huge identity of when did everything start? Within that is the identity feature that we personally are made of the same material that stars are made of, that the rocks are made of. If you pursue that, you quickly land up in a James Lovelock territory. And it's quite a fun territory to wander around. And within the religious debates, we're very quick to isolate. Humanity is very quick to isolate itself away as if it's something so special and so different that it stands in external observation to the mass. And what science has been doing is to bind us tightly in, right from the very beginning, to the stuff of stars, the stuff of the universe. We're all part of it, so our identity is bound in there. Now down the line, that's going to have some ethical implications for us. Just to have a look at the tools and approaches that people might take around it. I mean, simplistically, we can break the ethical tools down into 4 different broad categories. We've got our deontological ones, built on rules and statements. Tends to be ones, religions are quite good at that. We've got a right to life, a God-given life, maybe. And that's indisputable. Any ethical decision cannot move on that point, because it's a rule. Consequentialists' view of life, and these are the two that are really banging out against each other in some form of arguments and debates. Let's forget rules. Let's look at the outcomes. If we just drive by rules and rules alone, we're going to land up with some outcomes that we don't like. Well, that's silly, isn't it? So let's work from the other end and say, what outcomes do we want to arrive at? And whatever it takes to get there is ethically sound. What are the consequences? So you can say, we're going to burn oil. What's the effect of burning oil? So you start from the effects of it and you try to work back to find some ethically acceptable ways of doing it. You can take a narrative approach. It's much more like literary criticism in the way that you perform your ethical approach. And you look for the stories. What's sort of going on in the world at the moment? What are the patterns of behaviour between peoples? What are the people's stories that are causing them to go in this direction? What are the historic stories, the political stories? Looking for structures and patterns and seeing if by now analysing those you can derive some ethical pathways. And then you get down to virtue ethics, which is really about how you live well. And it's saying, well, our outcome in this wants to have a system that lives well together. And an example of that would be out in ecofeminism sort of line. It's around relationship that builds good systems ecologically on big scales. So we get back to chasing our own identity. And Peter Singer is straight out to the consequentialist line of thinking. And he's the consequentialist's consequentialist problem. And for him, having founded our identity in evolution as a pure point, with nothing else to influence that or perturb it, and you follow that through on a consequentialist line, you land up with a point where there is no way you can say that any species has any superiority over any other species. To do that is purely speciesist. What you've got to do is to find out some other way of coming up with a system for grading difference. So he works it down on the basis of how well you're thinking, basically. John Wyatt, a Christian neonatologist in London, refers to this as corticalism. So again, it's a differentiation, but it's a differentiation now on how well your cortex is working. For Singer, a well-trained animal that's really useful has got a lot more value in it and is a lot more worthwhile saving from the proverbial fire than a human being in a persistent vegetative state. It would be purely speciesist to take the human out and leave the sentient dog behind. So there's a lot of identity wrapped up. And you know, we've just been bouncing around the Discovery Institute's drive and fear of evolution. And actually their prime drive and fear is the outcome of taking a consequentialist route that is purely based on evolutionary theory and then using that to drive society. I rather like Peter Singer, which in many cultures is a controversial thing to say, because he has the honesty to pursue the consequences of taking the decision and then write about it. The problem with Singer, he likes where he gets to and wants to get there faster. And that's where we really quickly are coming. Dawkins has taken a different point and focusing identity. And that's a gene-driven view of identity. He then has this problem with what he has to do with human beings, because he does see them as particular and as different. So how's he going to differentiate that? And he has to say, well, they've sort of risen above their evolutionary status. And I haven't yet, maybe I've missed the patch and someone can point it to me, found a coherence in his argument as to how he makes that step. And science has jumped in and given us now a whole spectrum of different places to see personal identity. This is Louise Brown, as she is now. And it's seen quite particularly in the area of reproductive technologies. The mystery at the beginning of life has gone. You can do it in a test tube, you can do it in a petri dish, to be honest, in little blobs of water in a petri dish. Dolly has broken that mystery even further, because we can now no longer go back to the original ingredients but bud off life. Might not last very long. She is stuffed in her case. As in stuffed and stuffed in her case. And Polly pushes it even further. I'm surprised at how many people don't know about Polly and Tracy. Polly's the little fluffy one there. She not only has been cloned, but also altered genetically. So she produces it's often said a human protein. I'm always a bit nervous about that as a statement to drop, but anyway, she produces a human protein in her milk. A protein normally found in humans in her milk. As a deliberate mechanism of insertion, genetic insertion. So in terms of our identity, science has told us that it's something that we can play with. You can do that with a mammal. Biologically, there is no reason why you can't do that to a human. There's no reason why we couldn't make you glow in the dark. Just think of the light-saving capability of that. So what does that say to us about our identity? And from a religious point of view, what does that say about a God who might love us, and the religions who want to view down that line, if we can then change who we are? And it gets down to the line of, if so much is possible, what should be permissible? It's nothing particularly new. We've been playing these games for a long, long time. Dogs with their pug-nosed faces. Is it very clever to create a dog whose face is so involuted it gets diseases down in the gaps? Is it particularly clever to come up with a cow that produces so much milk, its rear end is so heavy it destroys its legs as it walks along? Is it particularly clever to come up with a pig that's so long it gets backache? So we're used to playing. Genetics has pushed it into a new territory in our ability to direct that play. But when we come back to look at the identity bit again, we're still chasing a genetic view of our identity when we're looking at human or non-human divides. We're expecting within this, as it says in here, looking for the differences in gene applications as a means of spotting what makes the human brain unique. And we're trying to find our uniqueness, our unique sense of identity, down a genetic line. Now that works and that's important only if genes are critically important. If you're a deontologist, it should make no difference at all. A straight Christian view could easily be that humans are different purely because God says they're different. Beginning of story, end of story. What's the need for chasing the others? And actually, I'm not convinced this sort of research is ever going to show up any plausible kind of difference between human and any other animal in a way that will ever give a grading. And what the identity, if you take the pure science line down is, more and more is saying there is no difference. We land up in a singer world. And we can ask when identity starts. And this is the embryonic question and issue that is bounced around and bounded around hugely. And science has had something to say on almost all of these points. We have our happy little sperm coming along, bang, and we've got the growth of our embryo. We can then pop off one of these cells and grow it in culture. And there's a huge amount of debate, both about the nature of screening tests we can do, at that point on these spare lifted off cells, as well as on the process of doing it. But the theory, the drive to do this is that we're wanting to find out the identity of the individual who we may plan to bring into existence in the future. Some people say has already come into existence. And the feeling is that by checking the genetics of it, and the idea of gene screening, I meant to bring me a little glass slide. It's got 142,000 gene dots on it. And that capability is driving the way that we can establish and question areas of identity really early on. Now, you then get into the ethics of what we're going to do with early embryos. And there's this very interesting paper in Nature just a couple of weeks ago from a group who was suggesting, well, you could actually perform that and the embryo wasn't destroyed. And it went through a number of very interesting and fairly rapid phases, because a week before it was published, I received a press release which quite clearly said that the embryos were unharmed in this. And later on that day I received press release number 2, which said that some were unharmed, but it shows potential. And then a couple of days later we got press release number 3, which was that all embryos were harmed, and there's a long way before it proved potential. And what had actually gone on there, and some of the reporting that then followed it, was that there was an excitement at the potential of it, which enabled the researchers, when they were actually being interviewed, and there's some very interesting sort of interviews that are out on the web that you can track down, well overstating their claim. And then at the end of the day, Nature then the following week actually published a news article explaining how this whole process had happened and how it had gone wrong and how they'd had to send out the 3 different press releases to try to come up with it. But it was all trying to get an ethical approach, because while science might like to say there's nothing about the embryo, there's a recognition in the back of their mind. When I've talked to scientists working on human embryos, there's a state change that they move into at that point. And I think there is an identity issue there that is being played with science and is chasing around. I don't have a resolution to it, but I think there's an issue there. The other technique that you can do is bring your donor cell in, having taken the nucleus out of an egg. You quite simply give it a little zap of electricity and then let it grow. The technique is called somatic cell nuclear transfer, otherwise known as cloning. And one of the issues with that is, again, you could pop the cell off and use it towards creating embryonic stem cells. Now, my feeling with that is that that would have been a highly unexceptional process, that nobody would have thought of being controversial at all if it wasn't for Dolly, who has really confounded the area. Because the expectation that that process was going to create anything that could actually survive, that you take an adult stem cell, an adult cell, attach it to an egg, and really get a fully viable mammal, wasn't very high. The fact that you can and did, on occasions, actually on incredibly rare occasions, but the fact that it was possible, again says something about our identity in a very strange way. Because it says no longer is our identity started and determined by a sperm and an egg coming together with a standard biological history, but we can create individuals with identity. Looking at some of the others, implantation has an interesting time to consider starting identity, and there's many down the religious route you go down that, because that's the point of establishing relationship. It's when the embryo really establishes a strong relationship with the mother. And people who follow relationship models of personhood often find themselves back at implantation. It's the point at which the hormones from the embryo start to redirect maternal physiology. A more common one out of the science market is down the primitive streak. And the main place that really came into play was the Warnock Committee's report that led up to the setting up of the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority. That took a fairly straightforward line of argument. The line of argument is that we establish when someone's dead because they're brain dead, not because the cells in their body have died. Life, therefore, demands some form of functioning brain. So, if you haven't got a nerve in your body, how can you have some form of functioning brain? And prior to 14 days, there is no chance of you having a nerve in your body. Therefore, there's no chance of any cerebral activity, even on a very, very minor level. So if we define death as no brain activity, life cannot have emerged yet. What Baroness Warnock is very keen to insist later in the document is not that they're saying that life starts at day 14, but it cannot have started before day 14. So again, it's another way of addressing the identity, that starting point of our identity. Quickening is still a religious point of identity starting. And in some courses of the Islamic faith, it's still an important part of identity, those times around 57 days, 65 days, and the like. But it's gone as a scientific one. Capability of independent existence is one that is coming in, I think, increasingly to English culture. And really that's being fueled by the neonatal intensive care unit. You can now get infants to survive as from about 22 weeks. The cut-off point is development of the lung. And if you inject corticosteroids just sort of for 3 or 4 days before delivery, you can mature the lung at about the 22-week stage to the state that it's just about capable of getting enough oxygen and CO2 in and out to enable a little character to survive. So the argument now is, well, maybe we ought to be moving the abortion limit to 22 weeks, down from 24 weeks, because we can see individuals who are very obviously individuals at that point. And science has moved that threshold. So we ought to move our legal threshold. I'm not sure that's an ethical debate or a legal debate. The two get a bit conflated at that point. At that point, I ask, are we ever independent? Birth is the legal cut-off for independence, for when your identity starts, certainly in this country and in most jurisdictions. It has surprisingly little scientific value as a point of demarcation, because there's very little that's actually happened to the individual around birth. Religiously, it's the point when you take your breath of life, which is why it's encoded in UK law. That's the root for it coming in. It's the breath of life going into the individual. And your standard post-mortem test to see whether the child has been born alive and then died, or is stillborn, is to take the lungs and put them in a pot of water and see if they float. If they float, you took a breath. You can then move to the Singer line, which is the capacity of rational decision-making. He's based rationality as his mode of identifying the beings that are worth having around the place. And his argument is you really can't see how rational a person's going to be until at least 9 months old. So infanticide up to 9 months makes huge sense, because your identity hasn't started until then. And if we pursue that, and if you want to pursue that, then his book, Rethinking Life and Death, is the place you'll see his argument unpacked. Another book around that almost draws from that, once you've gone there, is Steven Pinker's The Blank Slate, where he's arguing that, can you remember Mary Poppins? No, not Mary Poppins, Sound of Music. You know, I'm 16 going on 17. My life is a slate for someone to write on a blank page. Now he's arguing that that's not the case. Actually, he's arguing that there is no such thing as a blank slate, but it wouldn't have been such a snappy title. So the book's called The Blank Slate, but he's arguing no blank slate. And his argument is very strong, very forceful, that who we are is fixed in our genetic makeup and in what we are when we're born. Our brains are set up in the way they're set up, and we're just going to live that out. And you can see a sort of outworking of that in the Mail a couple of weeks ago. And there's seriousness. You know, the thought is that you can actually, you know, that science is enabling us to identify that sort of identity of the person, such that, you know, we can track this now. Now, I don't think it is, but it's getting out there into the popular debate in a strange way. Another one that was out there that's in August, Nuns Prove God is not a figment of the mind. And one of the problems again with journalism is that when you actually read the story didn't say that. But it was a jolly good title. And actually, title writers write the titles to get you to read it. So if you read it, it worked. It's not about taking the title seriously, it's a hook to get you to read the piece. But it was such that Stephen Jones was outraged. And so the next day they had outrage of UCL sending in his reply. But it's playing on the idea, it's playing along with the idea that our identity is really set up in our brains, and we're just living out our brain's identity. We've sort of been around it in a couple of different talks today so far, that if you could do a brain scan, you could find the religious bit of the brain. Presumably then you could ablate it and get rid of religion from anybody, because you've spotted the religious bit. And what never seems to be asked there is maybe it's that there is some religion that's lighting up this bit as opposed to the other way around. It's a sort of research that, as far as I can see, can't go anywhere, but is used as a mechanism for supporting a cortical idea of our identity. This was a previous one that got a huge amount of press coverage. Navigation-related structural change in the hippocampy of taxi drivers. Translated by the BBC is, taxi drivers' brains grow on the job. And one of the taxi drivers concerned said, "Oh, I never noticed part of my brain growing. It makes you wonder what happened to the rest of it." And to my mind, well, you can take it as in a few ways. I just don't kind of believe this piece of research. In any case, I come out of a physiologist world where if you're dealing with small numbers and you have to resort to statistics, there is no effect there. This is dealing with small numbers and has some quite carefully arranged, graphs, so that 0, which will be down here, is chopped off, so that we can extend the differences. And there's not huge differences with overlapping. Oh no, let's get the right bars. You know, overlapping bars and all the rest. It says all the wobble is down me. And with this particular shotgun plot, I like removing outliers on small bits of data and just seeing if it's still working. take those two characters out, and this whole story would fall to pieces. It's one of the most cited papers. The poor woman who did the research has herself had to seek treatment because she's been so inundated by the press. And so they've now set up a sort of protective unit within the department to keep her hidden from the press. And there's a desperation out there to grab at the tiniest straw to suggest that that's actually what's going on. And that we can now define ourselves by our brains, do a scan and make sense of it. And it strikes me that science has got a bit to answer for there. So just going down it, we've tried to identify ourselves and use different things. We've gone for genetic, there's the relational, there's a neural, there's a religious, there's a technological, there's a birth-related, lego-religious, and a cortical. Loads of different ways of trying to identify ourselves. And the two that are most predominant in the way we're thinking are cortical, and I think actually the technological is the one that's going to win over the day in terms of ethical debate that goes on. That technologically we start at the point where you can support life in a technological world. And the intriguing thing with that is we're then defining our identity on what our machines can hold in place. And I think that fits in nicely with a sort of a move through of seeing ourselves as mechanical beings. Not that I necessarily aspire to, but I think it fits into the debate that's going on. So if we started our identity, there's then questions that some within science are drawing about that middle bit of life. And Kevin Warwick's an interesting character. And he comes out with wonderfully wild statements. I was born human, but it was an accident of fate. I'm not quite sure what he means by that. A condition merely of time and place. I believe it's something we have the power to change, and I'll tell you why, which was the piece he started in Wired. And it's one of the most quoted pieces. I mean, bang that in as a phrase in Google. And it's there as if it's true, as if it's indisputable. No one, I've seldom seen any piece that questions that when it's written up. And he's part of the group, the sort of post-human group of people who are actively trying to get a dialogue that says, we can do better than this. It was an accident that we were created this way. And we now have the technology to do better. And the extreme end of that movement is saying what we actually want to do is to suck our cortical ability down onto a big processor. And then we'll be able to live indefinitely inside the machine. Now, I just hope the machine's better than my laptop. Because otherwise you've got a short life in there. But as if it's even possible. But I seldom see it critiqued sensibly. When it's out there, it's put out there as if we have this technology just round the corner. And he talks about his cyber sex that he has with his wife, having this implant in his head. When he thinks blue, she can feel this sort of buzzing sensation. It's not great, really. And he's got an implant that goes around and opens doors as he walks through them. Well, cats have that. Work on the cat flap. It's just you didn't bother to slip it under the skin. You've got loads of rhetoric, but within the middle of it is a debate about identity, what we want to see as human identity. And it's one that's saying we can follow a technology route down to the point where all we are machines. And actually then what we want to do, because we're very clever machine builders, is to build better ones. I think the only people who think they can do better ones are people who've never looked at something like a mitochondria or something. We've got a long way to go before we can make a machine that's quite as good as a mitochondria. Just to close, I mean, obviously in this country, just before the summer recess, euthanasia popped up as an issue. And if science has got some things to say about the start of identity, it's also wrapped up around the end of identity. And I think the euthanasia debate is being fueled partly by advances in medical science, and transplantation was what caused us to redefine death. Until the need for transplantation came along, death was when you died. It was when your body had stopped functioning, when you were no longer breathing, when the heart was no longer pumping, when that hadn't been happening for an hour or so. And at the point where everyone could say, right, died. Definitely died. But that's really inconvenient if you want to pop the heart out, or the kidney out, or something else. So we have to redefine our identity. So that scientific drive for the scientific medicine caused a total re-evaluation of the endpoint of our identity. It comes in another way, and the drive for euthanasia comes from the fear of being stuck in a life support machine for years without being able to say, I want off this leave, please. And actually that in itself, I mean, the Terry Zhivago case, you know, I'm not sure we had a living human being there towards the end of that. I wasn't there in the clinic, so I'd be cautious about pursuing it further, but there's nothing that I've seen that suggests that was the case. And we're getting to the point of defining our identity technologically, where it's almost a failure if you don't die in intensive care. Intensive care used to be something that you only went into if there's a good chance of coming out and not being first. Now identity is defined on this mechanical basis. You've got to be jacked up on that jack for the final survey from underneath. Otherwise we didn't really do the job properly. It's tied by the failure of medical science not to keep us alive. And alive away from ITU. It's fueled by an expectation, which again is a mechanical expectation, that we can control what's going on. We want to control it, we want to build it, we want to make it better. And a desire for perfection within that. And a feeling that we have the right for perfection. I'm not sure where the right comes from, but it's a feeling that we have a human right to these things. It's tied in with also an assumption, the euthanasia argument, that we have a right to dispose of whatever we want. Just to move on, identity isn't the only area where there's ethics and science conflicts. I think another one comes in the realm of trust. And we can see this coming out very particularly in the sort of human medical trials. And the issue there is when it's safe to start them. Quite often. Highly publicised one with Jesse Gelsinger. And the trust issue here is quite a simple who owns, who controls type game that goes on. And in this case you have a situation where the person giving authority was also the person who owned the patent, the drug company, the whole bang shoot, right the way through. So any normal limits had been removed the result was a pretty major loss of trust in the ability of science to deliver safe outcomes, and a fear that the people involved in science actually are slipping over into the world of technology, and no longer just with a blue skies interest, but trying to get a personal financial gain out of it. And the same questions got asked at the UK trial that went seriously wrong recently. And I've chased that around a fair bit. At the end of the day, the governing people all said, well, it was all done properly, and it was all above board with the rest. It still seems to be remarkable in that particular one that 6 individuals were simultaneously given a phase 1 drug, when you should actually give one, see the results, check it's okay before moving on. So apart from that, and that then fuels the speculation that everyone involved in the system is actually trying to cover the system up to keep it running. So within science, I think there's a huge need to build trust and to rebuild trust within a framework where you used to have the lab and then the application. And the lab and application are actually merging together more and more. And it comes largely out of a funding route. If people come and make a statement to me, one of my first questions is, who's funding you? And there's an anxiety about pharmaceuticals analysing favourable data. The question there is, how many pharmaceutical companies are actually now based in labs? Now, I was trying to report a story that was based out of one of the cancer research institutes in London. And the person was quite happily talking to me on the phone, and then right at the end he said, well, I just need to get this checked with the PR department before I can put my name on it. And they then came back saying, no, the story couldn't run. Now, as far as I could see, I could have run the story, he'd been talking to me. When I explained it, put it to him that way, and he went back to the PR department, and they said, okay, but you'll lose your job, because it's a breach of your contract to talk to a journalist in the first place. The bottom line of it was that the research he was wanting to tell me about would have scuppered an application they were trying to get for one of the startups within another lab that he was unaware of within the research base. Now, to my mind, there's a big trust issue. As soon as we're having to be cautious what we say, because we don't want to screw up somebody else's area, because this will show the fallibility of their research. It happened again around the time when stem cells were being debated in the House of Lords. And I was talking to a couple of people who were giving quite strong evidence as to why adult stem cells had more hope of going distance than embryonic stem cells. And they were both gagged by their departments, because they said, well, if you do that, we'll lose the debate in the House of Lords. So the truth wasn't actually allowed to come out. They said, well, you can talk to him after the debate's had, but we mustn't have that out in the press before the debate. There's quite a few people now who, in their academic contracts, have to have their work signed off before it can go public by the PR department. Now, I was at a science communications conference just before the summer, and I was arguing that was absolutely outrageous to the senior PR officer at a large research base in London. And she said, well, we just can't afford to have anything that doesn't hold our party line getting published. And I said, but if that's a scientific experiment that points in that direction, she said, no, you don't understand, we'd lose our funding. We can't afford to have that sort of thing published. Now, I think this is an area that science is really going to struggle from if that attitude continues much longer. Because I'm, a pretty pro-science journalist, and there's others around who aren't going to let that go on for long. And publication itself, and within the scientific community, there's a huge debate around peer review, and whether peer review actually does work as a trustworthy way of getting only good quality science published. Let's just try a quick straw poll. I mean, have you, with scientists here, how many of you have read a paper you actually got through it and thought, that paper doesn't stack together? Have you ever seen a paper? How good's peer review? And before you attack the journalists, how many of those have you read? It's not working as a system. And most scientists who are honest know it's not working as a system. And it's leading to a lack of trust within the publishing world. Now, how that resolves, I'm not quite sure. I was only asked to raise the issues. And the political pressure, that's where I meant to mention the stem cell story. And there's an interesting issue around whistleblowing. To an extent, there's a little clip here, it can be sort of seen as an almost honourable thing to do. This particular story is just slightly outside science, much more technology. This guy was the architect of a Citicorp's bank in New York. And just after they built it, he redid his calculations and worked out that it was just about to fall down. And the knowledge that it was just about to fall down would have been enough to close down Manhattan, because depending on which way it fell, you draw a circle around it, you'd have taken in most of Manhattan. What he did, so he thought, well, do I just retire, go away, and just hope it doesn't fall down, and that no one notices, and if it did fall down, well, I could probably cover my back in any case. He took a different line.
I refer with him. I said, look, if you got a license from the state and a certification from the university first, and now you're going to use that license to hold yourself out as a professional, you have a responsibility beyond yourself. That you see something that is a social risk, good heavens, this thing would kill thousands. You must do something. You must do something too.
And I think that you must do something it's something that isn't felt by the public of scientists and of the science community and the technological community. They're not prepared actually to stand up and say, look, I've got to do something. So there's a trust bridge that needs building again within that area. In case of whistleblower, break the glass. It is a feeling, and the people who have blown whistles haven't come off well. I mean, we mentioned earlier the South Korean embryo scandal. Well, the person who blew the whistle on that has had to go into hiding. The science community within South Korea has not been pleasant. The public community actually has got even worse. This scientist was a huge public figure, and to knock him down has really not been very popular. So the whistleblower has gone into hiding. And it's not just an Eastern phenomenon. It's a whistleblower in the States who didn't like the way that a piece of research was going on in the hospital that he worked in. And there's big profits, there's big status to be built up. So I think trust is an issue that's floating out there. And just finally, and briefly, because we're getting to the end of the day, the other place where there are ethical issues in science is in the choice of what we do in the first place. And I think it's a matter of looking for clouds in the blue sky. I mean, it was an interesting payback on anthrax research that happened just after September the 11th, when America suddenly found itself with anthrax spores floating around. And actually it didn't take very long for the American authorities to discover where the spores had come from. Because there was only one laboratory in the world they could have come from, because they'd been weaponized by the American military. And it was a very particular strain that had been very particularly treated to make it very, very nasty. And we have to ask ourselves, as scientists, as a science community, what research do we actually want to pursue? And I don't think you can stand back and just say, oh, it's all completely ethically neutral without looking at the outcome and the uses. And as nuclear energy was being invented, researched, whatever we want to call it, the people involved actually did start asking some huge questions about it. And the ripples of that are still going on. And there's another, I don't know whether this was science or technology, but it's my last example. In terms of deciding how we're going to use the resource and our capability. Just down here on the corner of the Gulf is a bizarre and huge development to create whole islands by squirting sand, by dredging sand from the Gulf and squirting them out into these structures. Every limb of these has penthouse suites along it. I can't remember how many thousand there are on that development. And it's not the only one, that's that one. There's a bigger one, and here's a huge one. That's going to be a map of the world, visible from space. Painted out in sand. And at the moment, the Sheikh has sold, I believe it's somewhere 80% of the apartments on it are already sold, even though it's still being built. And to my mind, it's a sort of mixture of a use of science. There's a huge amount of science gone into developing those islands, those artificial islands. And okay, it's a spillover into the world of technology, which is the one that I said I'd keep away from. But we have to ask ourselves, we have choices around. And is that the best way? The calculus that the Sheikh down there is working on is that he has a finite oil resource left. So he's going to use the energy in that oil resource to create the world's biggest holiday environment, which will then give him an income once the oil's gone. So he's using the last of his oil to build a holiday environment for the future. And it's a particular use of things, but I don't think it's isolated in its drives and issues behind it. And it comes down to a choice as to how we're going to use the resources we've got. Lunar missions and things. They're huge, and down an ethics line, you'd be talking about justice. There's a branch of ethics around justice and resource use. And the resource use to drive that sort of thing against the benefit that comes from it is one thing that is subject to question, needs to be subject to question, and wanders down a huge ethical area. So that was my 3 zones, and I think I'll leave it with that, and then we'll pick up some of the other issues tomorrow when I look at the public mind.
Peter, thank you very much for setting out those parameters so clearly for us. We're going to have some time for questions now. We will have a little break before dinner as well, so don't worry about that. And obviously will be more time to question Peter both tonight and tomorrow, but let's have some discussion and debate now, yes.
I think it's a bit unfair to ask, to do a kind of straw poll and ask if people have known badly refereed or peer-reviewed papers. And then sort of condemn the peer review system. It's a bit like democracy, it's the worst undesirable system we have. It's the best we have essentially. And if you look at the success stories are far outnumber the failures. But there have been some significant failures. So the question then is, well, what do you put in its place? And I think Sense About Science did a survey and did an article on it not too long ago. it's essentially the best we have, and it's difficult to think of an alternative.
And just because it's difficult to think doesn't mean to say that it's a good system. I don't think there's many editors around who are particularly happy with it. I mean, if you look at Nature, the editor of Nature, they've been running parallel processes to try to replace it with an alternative structure. Physics are moving to open peer review, where you actually publish the work and on the web, and all other people in the world can see that you're reporting it, they can see the data, and then they add comments to the site, and then the scientific community comes to it. There are lots of moves to replace it. There have been, I think, I can't remember the number, there have been a number of conferences around the world this year, purely to look at the peer review system, saying it is not working, it is too open to corruption, and we're very worried about it. So it's not a personal opinion there.
But
There's
I can understand it
large raft of academic debate that says it's not
for
working.
Nature or kind of journals like that. But if you look at the number of papers published every week,
Yeah.
to have a system that will cope with that number, it's difficult to imagine how you do that.
Well, and that's true, but the difficulty then is that the science and the academic scientific community place such a store on a published paper because it's been through peer review. Whilst at the same time acknowledging that, particularly in the small journals, that's not a huge step to go over. So you can't have it both ways.
But Peter, I was an editor of a journal for about 15 years, and I was editor-in-chief of the Journal of General Virology for 5. And I put my hand up because I can think of one paper in my experience which shouldn't have been published. And I think it goes back to the integrity of the editors, and who must be absolutely scrupulous and honest and open in what they do, who must not send the paper to referees who they know will bounce it, or to referees who know that they'll read it on the bus on the way home. When all those exist, that the system is not flawed, often the operation of the system can be distorted. So I think you put it too strongly.
It's difference of opinion.
Right. I want to quick.
Yeah.
I mean, you speak very pontifically about it, and I mean, I spent a lot of time doing it. And I just wanted to put another point on the table.
I probably read more papers than most people.
Well, don't let's try
I'm
and...
astonished by, and the ones that I get sent are the ones that people are so excited about they want press releases written. And I'm astonished by the number of errors in them that I, as a layman to their area, find and pick up. And the number of they're not. I'm not saying that you're picking up fraudulent stuff, because fraudulent stuff would be very difficult to pick up. It's just a low benchmark. It's a lower benchmark than academia likes to believe.
Is this on the same topic? Yeah. Okay. Yes.
Yeah,
Rachel.
I think we all, speaking as a baby scientist who just left science, but I think we all can look back at papers or our PhD thesis and think, oh, it says I'll do that as well as I can, but I think the point is that the system is working, and I've heard of the sort of other ways of publishing things, but they're not mostly in physics.
Yeah, physics is leading the way.
So, I mean, biology, well, look at this, but I think biology, the way biologists handle data is completely different. I mean, you can't go and check someone's calculations because you don't have all their data. You can't measure their slides or do whatever things. But a physicist can quite easily point out a hole in somebody else's data because they they can read you the calculation. And it's possibly a smaller area than biology, which probably turns out more papers than.
Oh, it's a huge area, it's a burgeoning area.
Should we let Chris come in? I think you had your hand up as well.
Yeah,
and then come back and comment on both things together.
I agree with the things that Phil was saying. For the sheer quantity of papers that are being published, and peer review has been shown that for the vast majority of things that get published, it does the job it's there to do. And I think that we should be thinking of peer review not as the be-all and end-all of scientific excellence, but as the first step for what is and isn't good science. I mean, that once it's been peer reviewed and it's out there for the scientific community to look at, it then needs to be replicated and other people need to look at it and so on. But as a first benchmark, what are we going to place it with that is as efficient and or better?
I mean, one of the suggestions is put back and read the editorials over the last year in Science and Nature, and I'm not standing as an isolated person saying this. It's not. There are other people who are significantly bigger than me.
Yeah. And another issue connected to that is the fact that scientists are at the moment, there is a phase of moaning about peer review, and understandably there are some flaws in it, but that partly relates to what you're talking about with trust, and the fact that scientists are moaning about their own system for saying that science is good has to be part of the problem of public trust in science. The publics are saying, "Oh, look at the scientists; they don't think that it's a good system, so why should we?"
Yeah, and it's driving deeper within science as to how you assess an individual scientist's career and progress. I'm doing it by paper counting. And so the research assessment exercises themselves have caused some pressures within the system that haven't helped this whole area as well.
I could also just add, I mean, it was, when I started out in science in the 1960s, then it was a big issue there at the time, and it's gone in waves, over the decades. So this is sort of an odd little story that gets replayed every kind of few years, and this sort of burst of activity and thinking. But it's amazing to my mind how it's always sort of settled back in what people have done, much longer since the 1960s, which is the old peer review system. So it's great to have a debate, and it's very healthy. But it's remarkable how, having had all the debate, it seems to go back to basically the way it was before, because people just can come up with a better system. Maybe there is a better system, but people haven't seemed to have arrived at that better system yet. That's the trouble.
Yeah, and the danger is if you ever working within an imperfect system, but to rely on it as if it's perfect without recognising that it's imperfect, that's when it starts to get dangerous.
I think there is one role where there could be significant improvement, if I might say so, in some journals, and that is where the actual sub-editors within the journal structure can be more critical of some of the referees' comments and not simply just take them on board as read without looking at them also. And the trouble is as a matter of time, there simply isn't enough days in the week to do that, if you've got deadlines and so forth. But I think in some cases, a more critical view of referees' comments by the journal editors. And there's some journals who have enough money and clout and people to do that, and they do a very good job on that, I think, and they have their in-house people who are very experienced, and that helps a lot. But of course, smaller journals are not able to do that because they just don't have the resources, so that's another factor. Okay, should we make
the same issue?
Yeah.
But doesn't most of it come down to what journal it's published in? It's like, there's a lot of journals that if I read a paper published in it, I probably wouldn't even read the paper, whereas if it came out in Nature.
And why not?
Because one thinks the quality of the peer reviews.
No. Not the quality of the peer review, it's the quality of the science in the paper. That certainly there is a pecking order. And I've seen papers which we've rejected from a journal that I've been editing appear in a lower pecking order journal. Now, the work was not fraudulent or spurious or incomplete, it just wasn't very important. And most journals reject 50%, 60% of what they're sent. And papers find that, and if you can get a paper in the front half of Nature, you do it a few times in your career. And if you can get a paper, but there are journals which I agree take most that's sent to them. So it's not a quality of the. I submit it's not the peer review that's the quality of the difference. It's the actual quality of the science.